Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel this elegant puzzle together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Let's get started. It was, as Poirot declared over his second cup of rich dark coffee, a morning of great perfection. The windows of the Imperial Hotel overlooked the glittering blue of Torquay Bay, and the sea breeze stirred the lace curtains ever so gently, bringing with it the scent of salt and sun-warmed stone. I was basking in the peace of it all, thoroughly relieved to have a few days of rest after our most recent case, one that involved, as these things often do, a missing diamond, a fraudulent countess, and Poirot's unwavering sense of superiority. He had been impossible since his deductions had left the local police in stunned admiration. Not that Poirot needed encouragement. "You see, Hastings," he said, adjusting the napkin across his lap with that fussy precision I knew so well. "The English sea air is very fine, but it is not as orderly as the air of my beloved Belgium." I let him ramble, focusing instead on the soft-boiled egg before me, which the waiter had somehow managed to both undercook and overcook simultaneously. "Look at you, mon ami," Poirot sighed. "You dream of your breakfast, while around you, the world reveals its secrets." I opened my mouth to protest, but was interrupted by the clatter of silverware from the next table. An elderly lady had overturned a fruit compote, and a waiter rushed to assist. "A tragedy," I muttered, reaching for the marmalade. "No, Hastings." Poirot's eyes gleamed with amusement. "It is a lesson." "And what precisely can one learn from an upturned dish of pineapple and plums?" Poirot leaned back, fingers steepled. "Everything, mon ami, if one only observes." The waiter, a slender young man with a nervous energy, approached the spilled fruit with cautious steps. Poirot watched him intently, his head tilted ever so slightly. "See there, Hastings," Poirot murmured. "The gait of the man. He moves with the left foot slightly more outward than the right. An old injury, perhaps." I squinted. To me, he simply walked like any other waiter burdened with too much responsibility and too little pay. Poirot's voice took on his familiar lecture tone, the one I knew all too well. "Such small things, mon ami. They betray the whole character. A limp can show us military service, or perhaps an unfortunate accident with a bicycle in childhood. A too clean cuff on a working man's shirt may suggest vanity or recent guilt." "Guilt?" I raised an eyebrow. Poirot smiled indulgently. "A man washes his hands too often, perhaps to rid himself of more than dust." I shook my head, resigned. These moments of psychological dissection always left me at once impressed and bewildered. Poirot saw what others missed, not through luck or guesswork, but through a relentless study of human nature. "And you think all this from the way a man walks?" "Not think, Hastings. Observe. It is entirely different." "And what does it tell you about our waiter?" "That he will soon spill the tea." Poirot folded his napkin neatly. At that precise moment, the waiter's tray lurched, sending a cup of Darjeeling cascading across my sleeve. "Good heavens, Poirot!" I cried. Poirot merely smiled. It was in the aftermath of the tea disaster, while I was blotting at my sleeve with futile vigour, that the hotel porter appeared at our table. He carried a silver tray, upon which rested a thick, cream-coloured envelope, its flap sealed with a bold red wax stamp. "For Monsieur Poirot," the porter announced, his tone half deferential, half curious, as though uncertain whether Poirot was a guest or a visiting dignitary. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "Ah, for me? How intriguing." He took the envelope with delicate fingertips, turning it over slowly before breaking the seal with his perfectly manicured thumbnail. The paper within was folded with military precision, and Poirot's eyes narrowed as they swept across the brief but startling message. "I hereby sign my own death warrant. Gerald Havering." There was no further explanation, only a request for Poirot's presence at Havering Hall that very afternoon. I stared in disbelief. What sort of man writes a message like that? Poirot tapped the paper thoughtfully. A man who wishes to be noticed, mon ami. Or a man who has no other choice. Our seaside holiday was, it seemed, at its end. Poirot unfolded the letter with his usual meticulous care, smoothing its edges between his fingertips before reading aloud. I confess, as he spoke the words, I felt a distinct chill crawl up my spine. I hereby sign my own death warrant. The signature beneath was bold and angular, Gerald Havering, a name not unfamiliar to me. I recalled hearing it in some business scandal reported in the Times, though I could not immediately place the details. What on earth does it mean, Poirot? I asked, leaning closer. Poirot said nothing at first. Instead, he held the letter to the light, scrutinizing the texture of the paper as though it might whisper secrets to him. His head tilted slightly, the way it always did when some small thread caught his attention. No return address, I muttered. Rather melodramatic, isn't it? Melodrama, mon ami, is often a mask for something altogether practical, Poirot replied. Observe. There are creases here, twice folded, but not with the same precision as the edges. This letter has been read, and perhaps rewritten, more than once. He placed it carefully beside his plate, tapping his finger upon the signature. And yet, what man signs his death warrant voluntarily? Unless... His gaze sharpened suddenly. Unless it was not his hand that signed it at all. That remark made little sense to me at the time, but I had long since learned not to question Poirot's leaps of logic. I only hoped the rest of breakfast might continue without further interruption. I was wrong. The logical course of action, to my mind, would have been to alert the local authorities and allow them to investigate the letter's origin. Poirot, naturally, had other ideas. There is something theatrical about it, Hastings, he said, eyes bright with amusement. A man does not write such a thing unless he wishes to be discovered or misunderstood. Do you think it's a prank? I asked, half hopeful. Poirot gave a delicate shrug. The English sense of humour is not quite so morbid, mon ami. He lifted the letter again, as though it were some precious relic, then folded it neatly and slid it into his pocket. We shall go, of course. Go where? To Havering Hall, naturally. I groaned. Poirot, we came here to rest. Precisely why I shall go, Hastings. A rest for the body, yes. But the mind? Ah, the mind must always be nourished. His fingertip tapped his temple dramatically. Otherwise, like an engine without oil, it will seize. And you think a man declaring his own death is nourishing, I muttered. Poirot beamed. It is delicious. There was no dissuading him, and somewhere deep down, I knew our quiet seaside holiday was well and truly over. Before Poirot could even request our bill, fate intervened. A portly man in a crumpled linen suit stood at the hotel's front desk, speaking in an urgent whisper to the receptionist. I caught the words, Havering Hall, and nudged Poirot. See there, I whispered. Something's afoot. Poirot, who misses nothing, had already risen from his seat and was beside the desk before I had even finished my egg. Excuse me, monsieur, he said, in his most winning tone. You mention Havering Hall. The man, startled, blinked at Poirot's sudden appearance. Yes, terrible business. Mr. Gerald Havering, found dead this morning, shot in his own study. Poirot's expression did not change, but I saw the spark behind his eyes. Suicide. So they say, the man muttered. Shot himself, clear as day. Poirot's moustache twitched ominously. I knew that look. The very suggestion of suicide had stirred Poirot's deepest suspicions. Mon ami, he said softly, the man who signs his own death warrant, he does not also pull the trigger. There is something wrong here. I said nothing. After years at his side, I had learned when Poirot had made up his mind. The case had already begun. Within the hour, We were seated in a hired motor car, bouncing along the narrow Devonshire lanes that led to Havering Hall. Poirot had fallen into one of his silences, the kind that suggested his little grey cells were already assembling facts before we even arrived. I, on the other hand, had my own concerns, chief among them being whether Havering Hall served decent coffee. Poirot's preference for order did not extend to English breakfasts, and I suspected this visit might involve long hours and missed meals. As the hall came into view, Poirot spoke at last. "Mon ami, prepare yourself. This will not be what it seems." The drive to Havering Hall felt longer than it should have. The narrow country lanes coiling like serpents between the hedgerows, with the sea always lurking just beyond sight. The sky, which had been bright enough when we left Torquay, had turned overcast, a heavy curtain of mist rolling in from the cliffs, swallowing the trees and blotting out the horizon. Havering Hall itself was a great grey beast of a house, perched precariously close to the edge of the land, its upper windows dark as though the house itself was in mourning. I confess, I felt an involuntary shiver as the car turned up the gravel drive. "This place," I muttered, "has the distinct charm of a family mausoleum." Poirot, who had been silently examining the house, now gave a small nod. "Yes, Hastings, it is a place where the past has left its fingerprints on every brick, and places like this, they do not forgive easily." I was about to inquire what he meant when the front door swung open, and a butler, thin to the point of transparency, stood waiting. He led us inside, the air heavy with the scent of polish, damp wool, and something sharper, cordite perhaps. As we stepped into the grand entrance hall, I couldn't help but note the portrait above the fireplace, a stern-faced man in late middle age, his mouth thin-lipped and severe. "Gerald Havering," I guessed. "No," said the butler, his voice so soft I barely heard it. "That was the first Gerald Havering. This house has known many Geralds, and now, it seems, one fewer." Poirot removed his hat, nodding politely. "Death, mon ami, is always punctual. It does not wait for invitations." We were shown to a sitting room lined with dark wood and still darker furniture, where Mrs. Havering awaited us. The sense of secrecy was palpable, as though the house itself held its breath. Poirot, however, seemed utterly at ease, settling into a chair with the air of a man arriving at a dinner party rather than a murder scene. "Let us begin," he said softly. Mrs. Eloise Havering was a woman in her early 40s, though she gave the impression of someone who had aged twice as fast in the last 12 hours. Her complexion was pale and blotched, her hands tightly knotted in her lap, and yet her posture remained strangely upright, as though sheer force of will held her together. Poirot introduced himself with a graceful bow, his fingertips pressed lightly together. "Madame, I thank you for receiving us in such difficult circumstances." She inclined her head, but said nothing. "Your husband," Poirot continued gently, "was found in his study this morning." Her voice, when she spoke, was thin and threadbare, the voice of a woman long accustomed to silence. "Yes, the servants found him. She faltered. "I was asleep." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, though his smile remained benign. "Asleep, madame." She swallowed. "I took something. A sedative. I didn't hear the shot." "Curious," Poirot murmured, "that a sedative would render you so completely insensible in a house as old as this, where sounds carry through every wall." I saw her flinch, ever so slightly, and wondered if Poirot meant to unsettle her deliberately. "You were alone in your room?" he asked. She hesitated before nodding. "Yes. Gerald often stayed in the study when we quarrelled." "And you quarrelled last night?" Her hands tightened in her lap until the knuckles shone white. "It was nothing." Poirot's smile broadened, but his eyes remained sharp. "Ah, madame, to a woman, a quarrel is nothing. To a man, it is everything." She gave a brittle laugh. "You didn't know my husband, Mr. Poirot." "On the contrary," Poirot said softly, "I know him already." A man does not write his own death warrant unless his mind is troubled by many shadows. Mrs. Havering stood abruptly, crossing to the fireplace where the remains of a fire still smouldered. She turned her back to us, staring at the portrait of her late husband. "I didn't kill him," she said, the words hurled like stones. Poirot rose too, with uncharacteristic grace and silence. "Madame, I believe you." She turned, startled. "You do?" Poirot's smile was almost affectionate. "Of course, but believing you innocent, that does not mean you are blameless." The room seemed to darken around us, as if the house itself disapproved of this intrusion into its secrets. Mr. Reginald Crossfield was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with the rough hands of one who had spent years wielding influence in boardrooms rather than in fields. His eyes, sharp and calculating, darted from Poirot to me and back again, as if weighing the cost of honesty. "You might as well know," he said brusquely. "Gerald and I were hardly bosom friends by the end." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "But you were partners in business, no?" "Were," Crossfield said grimly. "We had differences of opinion, you might say. Gerald was cutting me out, wanted to dissolve the partnership entirely." "And why was that, monsieur?" Poirot's fingers steepled, his gaze serene but relentless. Crossfield shifted in his chair. "He was paranoid, convinced I was hiding profits from him. Truth is, he'd made some foolish investments, and when they went bad, he wanted someone to blame." "And were you to blame?" Poirot's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp. "No." Crossfield's jaw tightened. "But Gerald wouldn't believe that. He threatened to take me to court, ruin me if he could." "A bitter quarrel indeed," Poirot mused. "Did you visit Havering Hall yesterday evening?" "No," Crossfield said immediately. "I hadn't set foot here in months." Poirot tilted his head. "Curious. Your car, it bears the clay of this very driveway." Crossfield's face darkened, but he said nothing. As we left the room, Poirot murmured softly, almost to himself, "A man who lies about where he has been, mon ami, is a man who wishes to be somewhere else." Miss Alice Waring, a nervous slip of a girl, twisted her apron between trembling fingers as Poirot questioned her. Her eyes flicked constantly toward the door, as though she expected a ghost to appear. "You heard quarrelling last night?" Poirot asked gently. Alice nodded. "They were always at it, sir. Mr. Havering had a terrible temper." "And what was the quarrel about?" Alice hesitated. "Money, sir. It was nearly always money." Poirot's gaze softened, but he leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "And yet, mademoiselle, that is not all you heard, n'est-ce pas?" Her lower lip trembled. I heard Mr. Havering say something about changing his will." Poirot's moustache gave a slight upward twitch. "Ah, that is most interesting. He said he wouldn't leave a penny to Mrs. Havering." Hastings let out a low whistle. "That's rather damning." Alice shook her head fiercely. "Mrs. Havering loved him, sir. She couldn't. Calm yourself, mademoiselle." Poirot patted her hand. "I accuse no one. Yet." He stood, adjusting his cuffs. "Tell me, Alice, when you brought the morning tea, was the door to the study locked?" Alice's brow furrowed. "Yes, sir, and the key was still in the lock, from the inside." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Très intéressant," he murmured. As we walked away, I said, "That settles it, surely." "A locked room, a suicide." "Non, Hastings," Poirot said softly. "It settles nothing at all." Dr. Samuel Arden greeted us in the library, a portly man with a ruddy face and the air of one who has spent a lifetime issuing pronouncements without expecting contradiction. "I was summoned first thing," he said. "I arrived within the hour." "And who summoned you, doctor?" Poirot asked. "Mrs. Havering's maid. She telephoned as soon as the body was found." "And yet," Poirot said mildly, "you arrived already wearing your surgical gloves." The doctor's ruddy complexion darkened. Force of habit. Of course. Poirot's smile was pleasant, but his eyes had taken on their sharpest glint. Cause of death is obvious, Arden went on hastily. Self-inflicted gunshot wound to the temple. And the time of death? Between midnight and 2 a.m. And you are quite certain of this? Completely. Arden's voice was too firm, too quick. Poirot gave one of his infamous tiny shrugs. Curious that. For you see, Doctor, the body was still warm when the maid found him at 6. The doctor's hands clenched at his sides. Well, there are always anomalies. Oui. Poirot smiled. Anomalies are my specialty. As we left, Hastings muttered, You think he's hiding something. Poirot tapped his temple. Not hiding, mon ami, forgetting. It is most revealing what a man forgets when he means to lie. Poirot entered the study with the reverence of a man stepping into a sacred chapel. I followed, less reverent and rather more aware of the chill in the air. The room was dimly lit, heavy curtains drawn, as though mourning its late occupant. The desk, positioned squarely by the window, bore the infamous letter, the one declaring Gerald Havering's self-signed death warrant. Beside it lay the revolver, a heavy Webley, its barrel stained faintly. The weapon of choice, I muttered. Non, said Poirot softly. The weapon of appearance, mon ami. He bent low, inspecting the revolver without touching it. You see, Hastings, the fingerprints. They lie too neatly, as though placed there like the cherries on a cake. I frowned. But the door was locked from the inside. The window, too. How else could it have happened? Poirot paced the room's perimeter, pausing at the French windows. The latch was firmly in place, the dust on the sill undisturbed. He inspected the key still in the door, giving it a delicate twist. It turned easily. A man intending to die, Poirot mused. He does not trouble to lock the door behind him. Unless, of course, he wishes the world to believe something. He lifted the death warrant once more, holding it at arm's length, his expression unreadable. And yet, he murmured, this is not the hand of a man resigned to his fate. I sighed, baffled as always. Poirot, you are making mysteries out of thin air. No, Hastings. I am simply sweeping aside the air to reveal the truth beneath. I had barely recovered from Poirot's cryptic declaration when he suddenly dropped to his knees beside the fireplace, his nose mere inches from the grate. Mon Dieu, he exclaimed. Hastings, do you see? I saw only ash, grey and lifeless. See what? Poirot produced his pocket tweezers and extracted something, a charred scrap of paper, blackened at the edges but with a single discernible letter. D. A fragment, he whispered, of something someone wished very much to destroy. Another letter? I suggested. Perhaps, or perhaps part of the original death warrant before it was rewritten. I stared. Rewritten? Poirot's eyes glittered mischievously. Mais oui, mon ami. What better way to stage a scene than to rewrite the script entirely? He turned to Mrs. Havering, who had lingered at the doorway. Tell me, madame, was your husband fond of theatrics? She paled. He enjoyed dramas, if that's what you mean. Poirot smiled. As do I, madame. And we are now watching the final act of a very elaborate one. He slipped the fragment into an envelope and patted it with satisfaction. No crime, Hastings, is truly perfect. The hands may be clever, but they always tremble, just a little, at the wrong moment. As we left the study, Mrs. Havering's voice rang out, her tone brittle with something between desperation and relief. There is something you should know, she said. Gerald had a brother. I blinked. A brother? You never mentioned him. She shrugged, eyes flicking away. I barely knew myself. Gerald never spoke of him until a few weeks ago. Apparently, they had a falling out years ago. Something about their father's will. Poirot's eyebrows rose. A brother who disappears. He is most convenient, madame, is he not? I don't know where he is, she said quickly. or even if he's still alive. And yet, Poirot murmured, his shadow stretches over everything. I frowned. What's a long-lost brother got to do with a locked room and a forged death warrant? Poirot gave me his most exasperated smile. Hastings, you are too literal. Think not of the brother as a man, but as an idea. I groaned. Here we go again. But Poirot had already turned, his mind racing far ahead. We had barely stepped back into the study when Poirot produced a magnifying glass and examined the death warrant once more. Observe, he said, his tone light but merciless. The loops of the letters, the pressure of the pen. This is not the hand of Gerald Havering. I gaped. You mean? It is a forgery, Poirot said simply. Someone else signed this warrant. Someone who wanted the world to believe in a suicide that never was. He straightened with a satisfied air. And now, mon ami, we must brace ourselves for the next act. The scream came just as Poirot folded his hands with supreme satisfaction. It rang down the hall, high, panicked, unmistakably human terror. We ran to the study, where the body of Reginald Crossfield lay slumped across the desk, a knife embedded in his chest. Poirot's face for once showed genuine surprise. Well, I said faintly, that's escalated. Poirot's fingers drummed thoughtfully. Mon ami, the man who forged one death warrant has now signed a second. The house had fallen into a peculiar silence by the time Poirot requested a private conversation with Mrs. Havering. I, naturally, was invited to remain, not for my keen powers of deduction, but, as Poirot put it, because every masterpiece requires a modest frame, mon ami. We found Mrs. Havering seated by the bay window, her hands trembling slightly as she held a delicate teacup. The cup rattled once against the saucer before she set it aside altogether. Poirot's manner was gentle but relentless, his dark eyes fixed upon her face, with the intensity of a man peeling back layers of varnish from an old painting. Madame, grief! It is a strange beast, is it not? Mrs. Havering gave a brittle smile. It is, Mr. Poirot. And for you, it is accompanied by relief, perhaps. She looked up sharply. Relief? Oui. Poirot steepled his fingers. When a quarrelsome man dies, it is natural for those left behind to feel both grief and, dare I say it, freedom. Her fingers curled into fists on her lap. You have no right to suggest such a thing. Ah, but madame, it is not I who suggests it. It is the language of your body, the tension, the stiffness. They betray you. Poirot's voice remained kind, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath. I was asleep, she whispered. I told you. I took a sedative. Of course. Poirot nodded. Yet you woke at dawn, oui? Yes. Her voice was barely audible. Because perhaps deep down you knew something was wrong. He paused. Or because you heard a sound you now pretend you did not hear. She shook her head vehemently. No, I didn't hear anything. Poirot smiled faintly. Madame, your grief is real, but so is your fear. She looked up at him then, and I could see her composure cracking, her face pale and drawn. Fear of what? I asked. Of truth, Poirot said softly. It waits for us, always, behind every locked door. Miss Alice Waring was summoned next. She entered with the hesitant, startled air of a rabbit caught too far from its burrow, her hands wrung together with such ferocity I feared her fingers might snap. Poirot invited her to sit, his manner far gentler than it had been with Mrs. Havering. Mademoiselle, he began, you are not, I think, a natural liar. She blinked rapidly. I don't understand. Non. Poirot's smile was almost paternal. Then permit me to explain. You heard something, did you not, on the night before Monsieur Havering died? Alice's lower lip trembled. Yes, sir. They were arguing again. And what was the subject of this quarrel? Alice hesitated. Money, sir. Money. Poirot's brows lifted. Such a small word, And yet it ruins so many lives. Alice's voice tumbled out in a rush. Mr. Havering said he was changing his will, cutting Mrs. Havering out entirely. I whistled softly. That's rather severe, isn't it? Poirot gave me a withering glance, then returned his attention to Alice. And Madame, how did she react? Alice swallowed hard. She said he'd regret it. Ah. Poirot leaned back, fingers once more steepled. And did you ever see this new will? No, sir. But I did hear Mrs. Havering say something about destroying papers. Très intéressant. Poirot stood, pacing the room slowly. So we have a quarrel over a will, a threat, a destroyed document, and a death. He paused. A delicious pattern, is it not? Alice stared at him in confusion. You think Mrs. Havering did it? Poirot spread his hands. Mademoiselle, I think many things. But what I believe, that is something I shall not reveal just yet. He escorted her to the door, his voice softer now. You are fond of your mistress, are you not? Yes, sir. She's been very kind to me. Then be honest with me, mademoiselle. Did you see anyone else near the study that night? Alice hesitated, then shook her head. No, sir. No one. Poirot's gaze sharpened. No one, or no one you recognized? Alice bit her lip, but said nothing. When she had gone, I asked, Do you believe her? Poirot smiled faintly. Mon ami, I believe that she believes what she said. But belief and truth, they are not always the same. Dr. Samuel Arden received us in the library, where the air still carried a faint trace of cigar smoke, though no ashtray was in sight. He sat in a large leather armchair, the very picture of country medical authority, ruddy-faced, waistcoat slightly too tight, and fingers yellowed from nicotine. Poirot took his time settling into the chair opposite, adjusting the crease of his trousers with deliberate care. Only then did he speak. Doctor, you attended Monsieur Havering for many years, I believe. On and off, Arden said. He wasn't what you'd call a regular patient. Too stubborn to admit he needed help. Yet, Poirot's voice softened. He suffered from a heart condition, n'est-ce pas? Arden gave a small grunt, neither confirming nor denying. There was some concern, yes. Angina? Poirot suggested. Possibly, Arden said. Stress, lifestyle. Men like Havering burn the candle at both ends, and then blame the doctor when it goes out. Poirot's moustache twitched slightly. And yet, doctor, when I examined Monsieur Havering's study, I saw no medication at all. Arden's brow creased. That can't be right. I prescribed nitroglycerin tablets months ago. Poirot shook his head, a gesture of gentle reproach. There were no tablets, no pillbox, not so much as a single lozenge. The doctor's face darkened. Then they've been removed. By whom? Poirot asked mildly. Arden shifted in his seat. You're asking the wrong man, Poirot. I treat bodies, not secrets. Poirot rose, smoothing his lapel. Ah, but bodies and secrets. They live very close together. The doctor's gaze flickered to the fireplace, where a burnt scrap of paper had already given up one of its secrets. Poirot noticed, of course. Poirot always noticed. As we left, I muttered, The man's hiding something. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Hiding, or forgetting. Sometimes, mon ami, it is the same thing. We found Mrs. Havering in the morning room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. There was an air of calculated calm about her, the kind that requires effort to maintain. Poirot wasted no time. Madame, on the night of your husband's death, you were alone in your room. Yes, she said immediately. I've told you this. And the house was secure. Of course. No visitors? None. Poirot's smile was as mild as cream. Curious then, because Mademoiselle Alice saw a figure, a man, standing outside the study window. Mrs. Havering's fingers tightened slightly. The girl must be mistaken. Ah. Poirot leaned forward, eyes suddenly bright. "But madame, she is not mistaken. She is easily frightened," Mrs. Havering said coolly. "She imagines things." Poirot's smile broadened. "Perhaps. Or perhaps she saw someone you knew very well, someone you preferred not to mention." Her lips parted in silent protest, but Poirot pressed on. "This man, he was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat." She exhaled sharply. "That could be anyone. Or it could be your husband's long-lost brother." The colour drained from her face. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Poirot's voice was silken. "A brother who quarrels over a will, a brother who vanishes, only to return when fortune changes hands." She rose abruptly, crossing to the window. "I know nothing about that." Poirot's head tilted. "Nothing, madame. Or too much." When she said nothing, Poirot gave a little bow. "We shall speak again. Outside," I asked. "You think the brother did it?" "Non, Hastings," Poirot said, eyes alight. "I think the brother is a phantom. The real question is, who invented him?" It was later that afternoon, while Poirot paced the length of the drawing room, that his little grey cells seemed to hum into action. His hands clasped behind his back, he moved with the deliberate precision of a man conducting a private orchestra, every step timed to a silent rhythm known only to him. "Hastings," he said suddenly, "do you recall the books in Monsieur Havering's study?" "The ones lining the shelves?" I asked. "Thrillers, mostly. Sensational stuff." "Precisely." Poirot's finger shot into the air. "And there was one, in particular, with a red cover." I frowned, trying to recall. Something about a murder staged to look like suicide. Exactement. The hand that signed the death warrant. A most unsubtle title, no? And yet, how curious. The method used in that novel bears a striking resemblance to our present tragedy. "You mean the locked room, the planted weapon, all of it?" I asked. "Not all, mon ami, but enough to be inspired by." He stopped, turning to me with a look of intense satisfaction. "You see, Hastings, when a man who enjoys theatrical mysteries is himself murdered, is it not logical to suspect that the crime may be a performance?" "But why would anyone stage it?" I asked. Poirot's expression grew serious. "To mislead, to hide the true purpose beneath the appearance of melodrama." He walked to the window, gazing out over the mist-shrouded cliffs. "There is an author to this story, Hastings, but it is not Monsieur Havering." "Who then?" I asked. Poirot turned, his eyes bright with mischief. "Patience, mon ami. The curtain has not yet fallen." We returned to the study once more, where Poirot stood before the desk, contemplating the revolver, the symbol of an apparently open and shut case. With almost ceremonial care, Poirot reached for his pocket square and lifted the revolver, turning it delicately in the light. His eyes narrowed, his moustache twitching in the way it always did when some small detail had spoken to him. "Mon ami," he said softly, "observe." I stepped closer, squinting at the metal surface. There were smudges, fingerprints left behind, small ones. "Alice Waring," Poirot announced. I stared. "The maid?" Poirot nodded. "Not the hand of Gerald Havering, whose fingers were broad and blunt. No, these are the fingerprints of a young woman, one accustomed to handling delicate items, or cleaning them." "But why would Alice touch the revolver?" I asked. "That, Hastings, is the delicious question." Poirot placed the revolver back on the desk. "For now, we must not leap to conclusions. Fingerprints tell us who touched it, not why." He tapped his temple. "It is the mind we must uncover, not the hand." By this point, I will confess, my brain was feeling rather overworked. Each new revelation seemed to contradict the one before. Was it suicide? Murder? Staged performance? A domestic tragedy? Or something infinitely more sinister? "Poirot," I said as we walked down the hall. "You can't seriously expect me to follow this." Poirot gave me a look of such injured innocence that I almost felt guilty. "But Hastings, it is very simple." "Simple," I burst out. "We have a locked room, a staged death, a forged letter, mysterious fingerprints, a long-lost brother who may or may not exist, and now a second corpse thrown into the mix. If this is simplicity, I'd hate to see your idea of complication." Poirot chuckled softly. "Ah, mon ami, you apply the English logic. One fact must follow another in a straight line. But crime, Hastings, is a game of mirrors. What you see is rarely what is." "Well, what do you see?" I demanded. Poirot's smile grew enigmatic. "I see a story, one that was written before the first shot was ever fired." "And what story is that?" Poirot patted my arm. "Patience, mon ami. Before the final page, you shall know all." We were walking back toward the study, Poirot's hands clasped neatly behind his back, his gait a curious mixture of deliberation and mischief. His eyes were narrowed in thought, his lips pursed as though he were tasting a particularly complex sauce. "Two deaths, Hastings," he said at last. "Two, and yet committed by one mind." I shook my head. "Well, that's obvious enough, isn't it? The same person killed Gerald Havering and Reginald Crossfield." "Ah, but no, mon ami," Poirot wagged a finger. "They were killed by the same brain, yes, but not by the same hand." "What on earth does that mean?" I demanded. "It means," Poirot said dramatically, "that the murderer is both present and absent at each crime scene." "That's nonsense," I said, feeling the familiar fog of confusion settling over me. "You can't be both somewhere and not somewhere." "Non," said Poirot, "unless one is an illusionist." "An illusionist?" I stared at him. "You mean like a stage magician?" "Precisely." Poirot's moustache gave an impish twitch. "A magician, mon ami, relies on distraction. What you see is never what is truly happening." "And you think our killer is… what? A magician by trade?" Poirot smiled. "Not by trade, perhaps, but by necessity." Poirot's little grey cells seemed positively electrified as he searched the wastepaper basket in the corner of the study. With his usual flair for the dramatic, he produced a torn theatre ticket, holding it aloft between finger and thumb. "Voilà!" he declared triumphantly. I squinted at the scrap. "What is it?" Poirot turned it so I could see. It was a ticket for a magic show, performed at the Imperial Theatre in Torquay, the night before Gerald Havering's death. "What has this got to do with anything?" I asked. "Everything, mon ami." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Do you not see? The very evening before the tragedy, someone attended a performance by the great Ostrello, a man famous for his disappearing acts, his locked room illusions, and his tricks with false compartments." I was still lost. "But who went to the show?" Poirot tapped the air with the ticket. "I suspect it was someone with a very specific purpose, to learn how to create a locked room where none should exist." "Then the locked study," I began. "Was never locked at all," Poirot finished. "It was merely made to appear so. And mon ami, that tells us one thing very clearly." "What's that?" "That the killer planned this drama far in advance." Poirot stood by the window, the torn ticket still balanced delicately between his fingers. His smile was that of a connoisseur who had just tasted a particularly exquisite dish. "Every magician, Hastings," he said softly, "has his weakness." "Oh?" I said, still thoroughly bewildered. "And what's that?" Poirot turned, his eyes bright. "He must always rely on his audience looking in the wrong place." He gestured toward the study door. "From the very first moment, mon ami, we were invited to focus on the locked door. But the true trick, the real misdirection, lay elsewhere." "Where?" Poirot pointed to the desk. "The letter, Hastings. The so-called death warrant. It was not a document, it was a stage prop." "And the revolver?" "Another prop," Poirot said with a smile. "Placed to draw the eye, to tell a story we were meant to believe. I sighed. And what story was that? That Gerald Havering signed his own death warrant. Poirot's expression turned serious. But a man who plans his own death does not attend a magic show the night before. No, mon ami, the man who bought that ticket was not Gerald at all. Then who? Poirot pressed a finger to his lips. That, Hastings, is the final trick, and I shall reveal it when the curtain rises for the last act. At precisely 6 o'clock that evening, Poirot summoned everyone to the study. The room had been restored to order, the desk tidied, the curtains drawn back, allowing the fading daylight to spill across the Persian carpet. I always marvelled at Poirot's flair for the dramatic, and tonight was no exception. The atmosphere was heavy with expectation, though none present knew quite what they were expecting, save, of course, Poirot himself. Mrs. Eloise Havering arrived first, her face composed but pale, a single handkerchief clutched tightly in one hand. Close behind her came Alice Waring, the maid, eyes wide and wary, her hands constantly twisting the hem of her apron. Dr. Samuel Arden entered next, his expression carefully neutral, though a faint sheen of perspiration had gathered at his temple. Inspector Morton, who had been called back to observe proceedings, took up a position near the door, notebook at the ready. Poirot stood before the fireplace, hands clasped before him, his moustaches bristling with importance. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice rich with theatrical gravity. "Tonight, we shall perform a little play, one which began with a curious document and ended with 2 men dead." He gestured to the desk. "The scene of our tragedy. Let us return it to its original state, just as it was when the body of Monsieur Gerald Havering was discovered." At his instruction, Alice positioned the revolver, the infamous death warrant, and even a glass of whisky, exactly as they had been. Poirot paced around the room, narrating as if addressing an invisible audience. "This, you see, was the tableau arranged for us, a story painted with great care. But as with all works of fiction, there are plot holes." He turned suddenly, eyes sharp. "Tonight, we fill those holes and discover the hand that painted them." Poirot paused dramatically, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the anxious faces assembled before him. "First," he said, "we must erase one great illusion. Gerald Havering did not take his own life." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Mrs. Havering's knuckles whitened as she gripped her chair, and Alice gasped aloud. "Impossible!" Dr. Arden blustered. The door was locked, the revolver in his hand. What else could it be? Poirot shook his head almost sorrowfully. "Doctor, you underestimate the ingenuity of the human mind, particularly a mind acquainted with stagecraft and illusion." He picked up the death warrant, holding it aloft. "This document, so very dramatic, so melodramatic, it was never a true testament. It was a prop." "A prop?" I echoed. "Exactement." Poirot's smile was thin. "It was designed not to convey truth, but to plant an idea, the idea of suicide." He moved to the French windows, tapping the latch. "The so-called locked room, a mere illusion, learned from a magician's trick. With a piece of string looped through the key, the door was locked from the outside, and the string withdrawn through the narrow gap." Hastings, meaning me, gave a low whistle. "That's devilishly clever." Poirot inclined his head. "Clever, yes, but not original. The method was lifted directly from a novel on Monsieur Havering's shelf." "And the revolver?" Mrs. Havering's voice was strained. "Placed in his hand after death." Poirot's gaze swept to Alice. "Mademoiselle, you placed it there, did you not?" Alice's face crumpled. I was told to. I didn't know." "Who told you?" Inspector Morton asked sharply. Alice's gaze darted toward Dr. Arden. The doctor's face turned an alarming shade of red. Poirot smiled. "Ah, and there we begin to approach the true curtain." Poirot stood at the centre of the room, commanding attention with his fingertips pressed delicately together, his head tilted ever so slightly to one side, his customary pose when about to unravel a web of lies. "Let us strip away the theatrics, mes amis," he began. For this was not merely a murder, it was a performance, a play, carefully rehearsed, with each actor playing a part. He turned his gaze to Mrs. Havering, who sat rigid in her chair, her fingers curled into tight knots in her lap. "Madame, you told us you were asleep, too deeply sedated to hear anything." She nodded, eyes fixed on the carpet. "And yet," Poirot continued, "what if the sedative was not intended for you at all?" Her head snapped up, startled. "No, no, madame," Poirot smiled faintly. "The powder in the whiskey glass in Monsieur Havering's study, it was meant for him. He was drugged long before the fatal shot was fired." A collective murmur rippled through the room. "You see," Poirot went on, "a man who intends to take his own life does not first render himself unconscious." Dr. Arden shifted uneasily in his chair. "But the revolver?" "Ah, the revolver." Poirot wagged a finger. "Placed there after death, to create the illusion of suicide." He paced slowly. "And the death warrant. What a dramatic touch. But a touch too dramatic, I think." Hastings, who had been frowning in concentration, blurted, "But why go to all that trouble if they simply wanted him dead?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Because the murderer wished not only to kill, but to mislead." He turned back to Mrs. Havering. "You, madame, have told many half-truths, but the greatest falsehood was not yours. It was planted by someone who understood how suspicion blooms from clever misdirection." He tapped his temple. "They wanted you to appear guilty, but not too guilty." The room fell silent. Even Hastings, for once, had nothing to say. Poirot now approached the desk, pausing to examine the revolver once again. This time, he held it up between thumb and forefinger, as though it were a particularly unappetizing piece of fruit. "Here is our first great lie," he said softly. "A clumsy forgery of death." He placed the revolver down with care. The fatal wound, a gunshot to the temple, was real, yes, but it was inflicted after Monsieur Havering was already dead. "What?" I exclaimed. "Then how did he die?" "Poison, mon ami," Poirot said smoothly. "Administered through his evening whiskey, laced with a subtle dose of digitalis, a poison well known to those with medical training." All eyes turned to Dr. Arden. Arden's ruddy face turned a remarkable shade of grey. Poirot's voice sharpened. "You arrived at Havering Hall very early, did you not, Doctor? Almost too early, as though you already knew your services would be required." Arden's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Poirot pressed on. "You intended for the poison to act alone, clean, undetectable once rigor mortis set in. But something went wrong. Someone discovered the body too soon." Alice Waring's breath caught audibly. "You panicked," Poirot continued. "You needed to create a distraction, a story the police would cling to, a staged suicide, complete with a forged death warrant." "But why?" I asked. "Why frame it as suicide?" "Because," Poirot said, turning back to Arden, "a brother who returns after decades to claim an inheritance. It is more credible if that brother inherits from a man driven to despair and self-destruction." The doctor sagged in his chair, his hands trembling now. "You see, mon ami," Poirot said, glancing at me, "the true weapon in this case was not the revolver, nor even the poison. It was the story itself." Poirot paused, letting the silence settle like a thick fog over the room. Mrs. Havering's breath came in short bursts. Alice Waring's hands trembled against her apron, and Dr. Arden sat utterly still, except for his fingers, which twitched nervously at his cuff. "But what," Poirot continued smoothly, "of the second death? The death of Reginald Crossfield, our late Monsieur Havering's business partner." I felt my brow crease in confusion. "What has Crossfield to do with any of this?" "Everything, mon ami," Poirot said. "For you see, Crossfield was not merely a business partner. He was a man who knew too much." A ripple of shock passed around the room. "Consider," Poirot went on, "why did Crossfield arrive at Havering Hall that day? He claimed it was business, yet there was no scheduled meeting. Non, he came because he had recently discovered something, a secret hidden in the past." Poirot's gaze settled firmly on Dr. Arden. "Something you thought long buried, n'est-ce pas?" Dr. Arden opened his mouth, but Poirot raised a finger, silencing him with the command of a conductor halting an orchestra. Crossfield had uncovered the truth, that the respectable Dr. Samuel Arden was not merely the family physician, but in fact, Gerald Havering's own illegitimate brother. A collective gasp rang out. "Mais oui!" Poirot declared. Two men, born of the same father, yet separated by scandal and circumstance. When Crossfield stumbled upon this truth, he saw an opportunity to blackmail the good doctor. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "But blackmailers, they play a dangerous game, mon ami. For it is simpler to silence a man forever than to pay and pay." Dr. Arden's face was ashen. "And so," Poirot concluded, "Monsieur Crossfield was murdered, stabbed in the very study where his old accomplice had just been found. Two crimes, one motive." Poirot took a single step forward, every eye locked upon him. "And now," he said softly, "we arrive at our final curtain." He gestured toward Dr. Arden, who looked very much like a man trapped beneath a collapsing roof. "It was you, Doctor," Poirot said. "You who administered the poison to your brother, the brother who refused to acknowledge you, you who forged his so-called death warrant, and you who staged the revolver in his hand." Mrs. Havering let out a choked gasp. "You intended the world to believe that Gerald Havering, crushed by guilt or despair, took his own life. A tragic end, no, but behind the curtain, there was only your greed." Poirot's voice sharpened. "You stood to inherit, did you not? By an old family will, one that favoured blood relatives over wives. But only if your identity as Gerald's brother could be proved." "And when Crossfield found out?" I asked. Poirot gave a theatrical shrug. "You could not risk him selling the story to the highest bidder, or worse, using it to destroy your claim." "So you killed him," I said. "Exactement. You stabbed him and left him slumped across the very desk where Gerald had died. A deliberate echo, mon ami, designed to suggest the sins of one man had claimed another." Dr. Arden's hands trembled violently now, his mouth working soundlessly. "Doctor," Poirot said softly, "you are clever, but you forgot one thing." "What?" Arden croaked. "Magicians must always fear the final flourish, the moment the audience looks too closely." Poirot raised a finger. "It was your hands, mon cher docteur. The hands that trembled when you arrived too soon after Gerald's death. The hands that knew too much, even before the body was found." Poirot smiled gently. "Hands betray the mind, mon ami, and yours signed your own warrant, just as surely as they signed your brother's." Dr. Arden's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. Inspector Morton stepped forward with a quiet authority. Poirot gave a satisfied nod. "The curtain falls, mon ami." Poirot stood beside the fireplace, his fingertips delicately meeting beneath his chin, his posture one of theatrical contemplation. The room was utterly still. No one dared to breathe too loudly, save for Hastings, who gave the occasional bewildered sigh beside me. "Let us, mes amis, consider the motive, the seed from which this wicked little tree has grown," Poirot began. His voice was soft, almost reflective. "For you see, the roots of this crime do not begin last week, or even last year. No, they are planted in the soil of the past." His gaze turned to Dr. Arden, who now sat slumped, his hands limp on his knees. "You, mon cher docteur, were born in scandal, were you not? An illegitimate son, a secret your father wished very much to forget." Dr. Arden said nothing. "But," Poirot continued, "there is always a paper trail, oui? An old will, signed when your father still acknowledged you, before you were cast out. That document lay dormant for decades, irrelevant while Gerald lived. But should Gerald die without direct heirs, That old will could rise from the grave, restoring you as heir. Mrs. Havering gave a small gasp, her eyes widening. That's absurd. Gerald never mentioned— Non, Poirot said gently. Because Monsieur Gérald never knew. Why should he? To him, you were merely the doctor, a convenient figure lingering in the wings. He gestured broadly. But you knew, did you not, Docteur? You knew the day would come when that old paper would prove more valuable than gold. Poirot's voice sharpened. And so, when Gerald made a new will, leaving his fortune to his wife, you knew you had to act. But why stage it as suicide? I asked. To disinherit the wife, mon ami, Poirot declared. A man who dies by his own hand invalidates his last will and testament, leaving the older will to dictate the inheritance. He turned back to Arden. A plan, monsieur, most clever. But a clever plan. It leaves fingerprints. Poirot, with his characteristic flair, produced the torn theatre ticket from his pocket once again, holding it aloft like a prize. This, he said, is the ticket to the truth. I squinted. The magic show. Exactement. Poirot beamed. The night before the murder, Dr. Arden attended a performance by the great Estrello, master of the disappearing act. Dr. Arden's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. You see, mon ami, Poirot went on, there was one problem with the plan. A locked room that could not be explained. I frowned, but the door was locked from the inside. A simple trick, Hastings. One demonstrated on that very stage the night before, using a length of string, a key, and a convenient gap beneath the door. I stared. You mean Arden copied a stage trick? Precisely. Poirot's eyes twinkled. He watched, he learned, and then he performed. Poirot gave a small bow, as though congratulating an invisible magician. It was a performance most convincing, mon ami. But all performances end. Poirot's gaze softened, and he walked toward Dr. Arden. But you see, Doctor, it was not your trick with the string that betrayed you. Arden's head lifted slightly, his face pale. No, Poirot said softly. It was your hands. My hands, Arden croaked. Oui. Poirot's smile was almost pitying. You are a doctor. Your hands should be steady as stone. But when you arrived at Havering Hall, summoned to attend a body not yet cold, your hands trembled. Arden swallowed hard. I was shocked. No, mon cher. Poirot shook his head gently. You were guilty. The hands, they betray the heart. And your heart knew exactly what you would find in that study. Poirot paused. It was not the fingerprints, nor the poison, nor even the staged letter that truly gave you away. He tapped his temple. It was your fear, the fear of what you yourself had done. Poirot took a step back, his expression solemn, almost mournful. You see, mon cher docteur, you were clever, but not clever enough. He drew himself up, standing to his full height, and declared, You signed your brother's death warrant, mon cher docteur, but you forgot, you also signed your own. There was a silence so profound it seemed the house itself was listening. Inspector Morton stepped forward, producing the handcuffs with quiet efficiency. Dr. Arden rose, his face a mask of exhausted defeat, and allowed himself to be led away. As the door closed behind them, Hastings gave a low whistle. Poirot, you make it look almost too easy. Poirot's smile returned. Mais oui, mon ami, because the greatest trick of all is to see what everyone else ignores. He tapped his temple once more. A man may forge a document, plant a gun, stage a crime, but his hands, his fear, his heart, they leave fingerprints no glove can hide. The study had emptied, save for Poirot, myself, Inspector Morton, and Dr. Samuel Arden, who sat in the very armchair where Gerald Havering's lifeless body had once slumped. There was a cruel symmetry to it, as though the house itself had prepared the seat for him. His hands, which had trembled so noticeably before, now lay flat upon his knees, His fingers spread wide, as though to prevent them curling into fists. His face, pale and glistening with sweat, wore an odd expression, part defiance, part resignation. "Is there even any point in denying it?" Arden's voice was hoarse, drained of its usual clinical detachment. "You've constructed your case too well, Mr. Poirot." Poirot's response was gentle. "Non, docteur, there is no point at all. The truth, it is already seated among us. All that remains is for you to give it a voice." Arden gave a bitter laugh. "Very well." His gaze drifted toward the hearth, where the last traces of the burnt letter had long since cooled to ash. It was always going to end like this. He inhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling with the weight of confession. "It began with a letter I found in my father's old papers, proof that I was his son, that Gerald Havering was my half-brother." Poirot's nod was almost imperceptible. "I wrote to Gerald," Arden continued, his voice turning harsh, "but he refused to acknowledge me. Said I was a blot on the family name, a scandal best forgotten. And so," Poirot said softly, "the seed of vengeance was planted." "Greed and revenge," Arden admitted. "Why deny it? Gerald was a wealthy man, and thanks to that old family will, all I needed was for him to die without a valid heir or a surviving will." His hands curled, fingers trembling once more. "I never intended to kill Crossfield, but the fool was too clever by half. He had a nose for secrets, and for blackmail." He exhaled heavily. "And so I killed them both, my brother and the man who tried to profit from him. And in the end, I paid the highest price of all." Poirot's voice was almost a whisper. "Oui, docteur, the price of your soul." We walked back toward the hotel in near silence, the sea breeze sharp against my face. My mind was still reeling, though Poirot walked with his usual placid satisfaction, as though he had merely rearranged a slightly untidy shelf. "Well, Poirot," I said at last, "that was certainly one for the books, though I still can't quite see how you solved it." Poirot gave me a glance both indulgent and exasperated. "Hastings, mon ami, you observe the footprints, but you miss the footprints in the mind." I sighed. "And that means?" "It means," Poirot said, "this case was not solved by fingerprints, by burnt papers, or even by the revolver. It was solved through psychology." I frowned. But there was so much evidence. "Pah!" Poirot flung out a hand. "Evidence is the servant of the truth, not the master. What truly revealed the murderer was his fear." "Fear?" "Oui." Poirot's voice grew reflective. "Consider, Hastings. Dr. Arden was not a criminal by nature. He was a man who spent his life healing others, trusted by his patients. And yet that trust, that intimacy between doctor and patient, was precisely what gave him the power to kill." He tapped his temple. "Arden knew Gerald's weaknesses, his health, his habits, his trust in medical authority. He knew precisely which poison would mimic a heart attack, precisely which moment of vulnerability to exploit." I shuddered. "That's rather cold-blooded." "Non," Poirot said softly. "It was desperate. Arden was not a mastermind. He was a frightened man who could not bear rejection. His first crime was committed from wounded pride, his second to cover his tracks." "And his hands," I began. "Ah, the hands," Poirot exclaimed. "The betrayers of the mind, for all his medical skill, all his control, they trembled. Because deep down, mon ami, guilt lives in the fingers." I shook my head in wonder. "You always say these cases are psychological, Poirot, but I never quite believe you until the end." Poirot smiled, his moustache twitching. "Because you think, Hastings, but you do not observe." We were back in our hotel lounge, a small fire crackling in the hearth, the storm now spent outside. Poirot, neatly ensconced in his armchair, held the torn theatre ticket between his fingers, turning it over with delicate care. "There, mon ami," he said softly, "is the clue that solved everything." I peered at the scrap. A ticket for a magic show. What's so extraordinary about that? "Ah, Hastings, Poirot sighed dramatically. You have the ticket, but not the understanding. He flicked the paper with one finger. Why should a man, the night before he plans to take his own life, indulge in an evening of entertainment? Well, perhaps it was to distract himself. Non. Poirot shook his head. A man contemplating death does not seek illusion, but a man planning a murder most elaborate. Ah, that is another matter entirely. He tapped the ticket lightly. The great Ostrello, the master of the locked room trick, the vanishing object, the disappearing key, all lessons Dr. Arden required to stage the perfect crime. But surely, I protested, he could have learned such tricks from a book. Possibly, Poirot admitted. But books do not show the movement, the flick of the wrist, the turn of the finger. The nuance, Hastings. This was not a man casually interested in illusion. This was a man who knew that the success of his plan depended upon the performance. He placed the ticket gently on the table. The torn ticket, a relic of his obsession with controlling reality itself. But mon ami, even the cleverest magician cannot outwit his own nerves. Poirot leaned back, his eyes half closed, as if savouring the irony, like a fine after-dinner liqueur. Do you see, Hastings, he murmured, how deliciously cruel fate can be? I raised an eyebrow. How so? Doctor. Arden, Poirot said. A man obsessed with illusion, with creating the perfect performance, was undone not by evidence, but by his own body betraying him. He held up his own hands, fingers perfectly steady. The hands of a magician or a murderer must not tremble. But they did, I said. Exactement. Poirot smiled. For all his skill in deception, his guilt lived in his fingertips. He steepled his fingers once more. A man who sought to control reality was, in the end, undone by the truth he could not hide. As we settled the bill and prepared to leave the hotel, a porter approached Poirot, handing him a small envelope. Another mystery, Poirot? I asked, with what I hoped was only mild sarcasm. Poirot opened it, glancing at the contents. His moustaches twitched in amusement. Non, mon ami, merely the breakfast menu. I exhaled with relief. For once, we can have a peaceful morning. Poirot gave me a knowing smile. Ah, Hastings. One must never underestimate the importance of breakfast. A good egg, it can reveal more about a man than 1,000 documents. He tucked the menu into his pocket, then added, almost to himself, and yet, I have always found that after one case ends, another is never far behind. I groaned. You mean you're already looking for another? Poirot's eyes twinkled. But of course, for as long as there is human vanity, greed and folly, there will be work for Hercule Poirot. With that, he stepped gracefully into the waiting cab, leaving me to wonder, was the next death already waiting for us at breakfast? As the case of Gerald Havering's death comes to its final curtain, one truth stands clear. No illusion, no matter how carefully staged, can ever truly outwit the little grey cells. In the end, it was not the evidence of fingerprints or forged letters that solved this crime, but the simple trembling of guilty hands, a reminder that even the cleverest criminals cannot escape the psychology of guilt. For Poirot, the greatest mysteries are not locked doors or missing keys, but the secrets human nature cannot hide. It is there, in the trembling fingers, the rehearsed alibis, and the fear behind the eyes, that the truth always reveals itself. As we left the hotel, I turned to Poirot and said, "Well, at least this time the trick wasn't up your sleeve. It was in the murderer's hands." Poirot gave one of his enigmatic smiles. "Ah, Hastings, it is always so. The hands, they obey the mind. But the heart? Ah, that is where the real crime always begins. What do you think was the most important clue that gave Dr. Arden away? Was it the burnt letter, the magic ticket, or the trembling hands? Tell us your theory in the comments below. If you enjoyed unraveling this Hercule Poirot mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more classic detective stories to life. And with Poirot, the next mystery is always just around the corner. Stay tuned for more cases where the truth hides in plain sight.